Welcome everyone in this final session, in this final roundtable on diversity and inclusion. I know it's late in the afternoon, but I would rather call it the final stretch as we are addressing a very important topic for all of us who are privileged to be here. So I think it's good to take part in this debate on how can we do simply better to be more inclusive and make our academic and research network more inclusive. So my name is Šárka Kolmašová. I'm at the Metropolitan University Prague. I'm the head of the Department of International Relations and European Studies, but also affiliated with the Center for Security Studies. I'm with the network, also board member of the network, so I'm within these circles from some time. And today we will focus on, as I mentioned, diversity and inclusion. It's a follow-up, I would say, to the roundtable we had last year in Barcelona, which was more specifically on gender aspects of academia, doing research, etc. So basically, we want to facilitate a critical discussion on broader aspects of inclusion, not limited to gender, which is great. At the same time, I think we want to narrow it down a little bit to practical aspects so that we move on from the general conclusion of the last conference that we have to acknowledge some gendered aspects of discrimination and focus more on how can we do better simply. So we have today an esteemed panel of speakers. So I will first introduce our kind panelists who are here today, and then I will proceed to the questions that I circulated to the panelists. But I will be happy if you join our conversation. So it's a roundtable basically that is designed for interaction with the audience. So first I have the pleasure to introduce Damien van Puyvelde. I say it correctly. Perfect. Damien chairs the Intelligence and Security Group of the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. His expertise is in contemporary intelligence, technology, and cybersecurity. And beyond his research in those areas, he also serves as member of the scientific committee in Leiden. He also chaired the largest network of intelligence studies researchers in the world, we can say, the Intelligence Studies section of the International Studies Association, and also serves on the editorial board of Intelligence and National Security Journal. So you have a lot of experience and background in chairing and managing different networks and groups, which is perfect for our discussion. Second, we have Federica, who joined us online. It's amazing you joined us. You basically saved the day. Otherwise, what I said before, we would have a medal, which would be very unfortunate for a debate on diversity and inclusion. So thank you, Federica, for kindly joining us online. Federica Cristani is a senior researcher and head of the Center for International Law at the Institute of International Relations in Prague. She's specializing in international law and human rights, and her recent work focuses on legal aspects of cybersecurity and the protection of vulnerable groups in conflict zones. She's also actively engaged in policy advocacy and collaborates with different organizations, such as the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. She's also the member of the committee of the trade union at the Institute of International Relations, and recently she was co-editor of the book Women Empowerment and Its Limits. Last but not least, we have Raffaele Mastrocco from the European University Institute. He's a Max Weber Fellow and at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. And his research is at the intersection of international relations and political economy, with a particular focus on security policy and migration. Raffaele has an impressive academic background, also completed his PhD at the University of Florence, where he specialized in political and economic aspects of security studies. And he focuses on European security measures, how they affect migration and human rights. So these would be our great panelists, and I would like to share the questions that I circulated again And we will proceed as follows. We will start with the first question and then group the other 2 questions in the second round. So we will take 2 in total. First, I would like to discuss the question, how do intersecting identities based on ethnicity, gender, sexuality, but also socioeconomic status influence our preference of particular security paradigms? So basically, we will discuss how our identity and background has implications on what we focus on and how we even conceptualize security and security studies. And then maybe you could provide some examples from your research or current global events, how these intersections have reshaped traditional security perspectives. And then we will proceed to the 2 other questions, basically more practical. The first one, as you can see, is like very theoretical and I would say even epistemological, methodological. But then we will proceed to practical questions while increasing the representation of women, people of color, and other marginalized groups is a step forward. Basically, inclusivity requires more than just adding diverse individuals to existing structures. That is a common pitfall and problem that we see. So what systematic changes and organizational shifts are necessary within academia and also different institutions to create an environment where diverse perspectives are genuinely valued and integrated into the core of the discipline? So how can we simply move beyond tokenism, symbolic and very, I would say, formalistic inclusion, adding people on panels, adding them to the structures? How can we build more, I would say, deeper change? And finally, our last question will be narrowed down to the European Initiative for Security Studies. Very simply, what can we do better as an organization, as a platform? What measures can we take to ensure our annual conference is more inclusive and welcoming to scholars with diverse backgrounds? And if there are any particular practices or policies from other initiatives and conferences or from your institutions that you could share with us. And especially the last question, as I said, is addressed to the broader audience, so we can then all collectively discuss that question. So these are the questions that I would like to discuss today. As I said, we will start with the paradigm, with the security field, and I will ask Damien to start. Then we will proceed to Federica and finally Raffaele. So the floor is yours.
Should I start actually, or should Federica start as a woman and as someone who works on these questions?
I think it's okay. You can start, and then we keep Federica as the second one.
So I'm or different, I think for all 4 of us, Silvia D'Amato asked me to join the panel, and I felt uneasy, and I still feel uneasy talking about these questions. I don't feel a lot of legitimacy, but I do have some stuff to say, so I'll say them. But already that's been quite transparent about positionality, possibly. I'm a white male, heterosexual, and I come from a privileged socioeconomic background. And I started looking at security because I was interested in intelligence agencies, so in more on the realist side, perhaps, or hard security questions. During my PhD studies, I was confronted to a lot of different paradigms, different PhD colleagues that were much more diverse than my background, let's say. And then my first job post-PhD was at the University of Texas at their campus in El Paso, southwest US border. And that's a university or campus that has a role to serve the local community, which is from a lower socioeconomic background with 80 to 90% of our students that were of Hispanic heritage. And that's maybe a bit more sensitive, perhaps, to some of the questions that we want to discuss today, particularly gender, sexuality, and the status of ethnic minorities in the US, which struck me the way it was approached as someone who grew up in Europe and studied in the UK. So perhaps that explains why I started looking at these issues. Specifically, some students were practitioners, women practitioners in the intelligence space. And when we were talking about class, they were telling me about some of the discriminations they were facing. And that triggered for me the interest in looking at women and different ethnic minorities and their role within the US intelligence community. So I started looking at that. For another research project, I stumbled upon socio-economic and ethnic minority data of the US intelligence community in the mid-2010s. And then with a colleague, we wrote an opinion piece in the US about that and received a lot of shit about it online by Breitbart and so on, some threats also. But that was okay. And then I decided to publish a research paper that looked more deeply at how the CIA had approached women in their own kind of human resources, administrative documents in their archives. And when I did that, I saw that there was also from very early on, they were looking at Black employees. The way they named them was different across time. So I ended up writing a paper on Black people and women at the CIA, which also made me feel very uncomfortable because I'm neither, and I was writing about stuff, that don't really directly concern me, let's say, or do I feel concerned about them? And again, the paper was, I think it was a decent paper, submitted to a top journal in American studies where the editor told me it was not important enough, and that was in 2018, maybe, that, nobody really cares about these issues in American studies. So I then submitted it to another journal in IR where it was published. And then once it was published, there was some pushback also that I, along other colleagues who publish on these issues, are politicizing our field or sub-field of studies, intelligence studies. So this is just a small example. And then pushback also because I had broader roles as a chair of a ISA section in intelligence studies, that I had let this sort of issue arrive on the agenda of our section, and that therefore I was politicizing the field of study and allowing it to just spread beyond what should be academia. So there's been some pushback on that. So this is all a bit negative, the way I frame it, but there's also a lot of support from colleagues on that. I'm not complaining, I don't think I'm in a privileged situation, and I've nothing to lose. I don't care if some older white guys are not happy about me talking about this, or deciding that we need diversity in the panels and in the teams we have. I really couldn't care less, but I'm concerned a bit about the way this is perceived by other colleagues in the field, the reputation it gives to our field, the way early career scholars look at these debates, especially when it leads to publications making some of these claims in academic journals or in pseudo-academic journals, I should say. So yeah, that's all kind of very personal kind of point of view on this, and that's the only way I could relate, as opposed to making like broader arguments, which would be much more intellectual, and which I hope Federica can offer us some of that.
I very much appreciate your honest and I think very great insights. Federica, please, can you also share your...
Thank you so much, Šárka, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so sorry that I couldn't make it in person, and next time I promise. But it's my background is not in security studies, so I have to make a caveat here, because I'm an international lawyer, so I come from a different field maybe, but I think maybe to my but I'm very curious to hear your experiences and how we can combine everything together, because I think maybe some of the topics will be maybe some of the issues will pop up in every pops up in every disciplines, unfortunately, I would say. But and also maybe I was started sharing something, was also thinking started sharing something personal, but back into my PhD studies maybe, because before now I'm also studying cybersecurity, and also have a project on climate litigation and human rights, where we are also addressing the concept, what is now the new concept of slow violence, and especially targeting vulnerable groups or women. So we're also conducting a little bit of interviews on addressing how vulnerable populations, and in vulnerable populations, so we can include actually everyone, and not only women, but also children, persons with disabilities, indigenous people, or whoever want to call it. And it's very interesting to see how the concept of climate change is perceived differently by these people, and how these people are trying now to bring their claims also to the courts, to start also to make also states somehow responsible for what they are doing or not doing in climate change towards these vulnerable people. And this is somehow how this, let's say, how this social activism is moving, is somehow also reshaping the way also climate change studies are addressing the topics, which is also very interesting to see. This leads back a little bit to what was part of your question, how this also intersectionality also can reshape the studies. Actually, it can, whenever there is a new, whenever it's a gender or when it's a vulnerable groups that come to the table of the discussion, then what I see is that most of the time as an academic, I need also me as a woman. It's not because I'm a woman. I know everything about gender studies, of course, but it's sometimes I need also new methodology. I need new instruments to understand the phenomenon and to address it in the proper way. And also, I think this applies more or less in many disciplines, because not only I was thinking about climate change, because it's something that I'm working on now, but I was doing my PhD actually on international investment law. So I started as international investment lawyer at first, and international investment law, especially years ago, was a very male-dominant field. Especially there were mostly male colleagues studying international investment law. That was very visible when, as a PhD student, I was going to conferences. We were actually 1 or 2, 3 female colleagues there, and it was really interesting. And this is also something which is dealt with because it's something that drives also the perception that maybe economic studies are studies that are maybe male perceived like more suitable for male colleagues and not for female colleagues, and also linked to the practitioner part of it, because many colleagues also studying, for example, in international investment law, are also lawyers working in law firms. And most of the times also clients, for example, feel more comfortable, let's say, with a male lawyer instead of a female lawyer, especially in certain contexts, in certain regions. It's not all the same, of course, in all the countries and in all the regions, but there is this kind of tendency. And of course, what is happening this in practice also affects how studies, who studied these topics. So everything is correlated. It's not only about academia, it's also about practitioners. So I think it's quite interesting to see. Things are changing, of course, now. And I would say sometimes you have now, on the contrary, a lot of female colleagues studying international investment law, economic studies, but still not so many on the practitioner level, for example. And this is very evident. For example, I was looking at some data about investment, about arbitrators who has been appointed in investment arbitration in the last 10 years, and among 1,000 appointments, only 100 and something were women. So you see that the proportion is really strong, and this reflects also how things go also in practice a little bit, because for example, now there is UNCITRAL, the UN mission for trade and development, are trying to, the states and NGOs are trying to have some discussion on how to reform investor-state arbitration, and this specific question of arbitration and the women in arbitration has not been dealt with. And I think it's very telling on how difficult it can be to reshape also a discipline, also to introduce the topic into a discipline. And I think for now I will stop here because I've talked about many different things, but I'm happy to go back to any of them so during the discussion.
Thank you very much, Federica. So please, Raffaele, if you can.
Yes, thank you very much, Šárka. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm very happy to be in this panel, and thank you also for the contribution so far. Just a premise before starting discussing answering the question is that I don't work on critical security studies, but I'm interested in queer inclusivity in academia, and I'm very much interested in the debates addressing inclusivity, both yes, in academia more broadly, but also in research agendas. I also talk from a very privileged perspective. I'm a white man after all, but perhaps the contribution that I can bring here to the table is a discussion about fieldwork and how we perceive intersectionality has something to do with the security paradigms that we study very much. From the fieldwork that I just finished, also just a smaller point, I work on anti-establishment parties, the far right and populists, and how they affect security cooperation in Europe. And from the fieldwork that I just finished in Rome and Brussels, it was very much clear that the way that these political actors think about security touches upon the essence of intersectionality and how they try to frame security is very much related to that. But let me just say that for me, the fieldwork was especially important to understand that every type of security is intersectional. I think we can see that different ways at different levels, depending also on the subject that we study. When we study, for instance, human security or security interventions, it might be more obvious to look at also how the security of women or ethnic minorities might be impacted by security interventions, for instance, but not always in intersectional terms, right? When we talk about strategic studies, maybe it's more about how many women are present in the military, for instance, and how this can have an impact in the strategic thinking about security. But I'm saying that intersectionality, well, security is always intersectional because after all, the reference subject of security is what we study. So we need to understand all the different identities and dimensions and how they intersect with each other of people that need to be secured in a way. And we also need to think about the appropriate tools to secure those people. I believe that often we tend to gender and racialize the reference subjects of our studies, and we risk to simplify in binary terms this reference, especially this reinforces the existing power structures of the security subjects. But at the same time, identities are always intersectional, and this matters also for how communities are organized, how they are formed. And I believe that we should really put some effort to consider how to address intersectionality to avoid excluding reference from the security exercises that we analyze. Concerning my fieldwork, what became clear is that anti-establishment parties in Europe, they have a very simplified vision of security, of who needs to be secured. It's a very traditional understanding of identity as well, where there is an out group that is always a threat, that is often racialized, and an in group that needs to be protected. It's always, or at least often, white and European, and that is always part of a patriarchal vision of society. Now, this might not come as a surprise for you. It wasn't really for me as well. But I think what struck me there is that these parties are appropriating, well, the security narratives of more progressive camps. So, for instance, when they say when they talk about security, they would justify having security cooperation with autocratic countries in Africa, for instance, by saying that they take a post-colonial approach, they don't want to impose any rights, but in this way, it means achieving kind of more security in pragmatic terms. So that's what they argue about. But in reality, this really exacerbates the security risks of the people in the third countries and ignores the intersectionality of and the identity of the communities that they claim to secure, right? Just to conclude, I think also my experience in my fieldwork, I think it was important for me because it made me raise questions about how traditional perspectives of security risk actually raising the insecurity when they don't really consider intersection. And just a postscriptum. I think also the access, I think it would be very interesting to have a conversation on access to field work. I believe Federica briefly mentioned it, but I was very privileged to have an Italian name and to be a white man and to go to NATO or the EU to discuss about these issues. Well, I know that it's a bigger problem for women perhaps that try to have the same type of access. So I think in general, anticipating a bit also your further questions, I think the community should try to come up with support efforts in granting equal access to fieldwork as well. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you all very much for the initial insight. It was very interesting as we were talking about this, like self-reflections within the communities and within the field. So I would only add that I think even within the preparation of the program or the sections, and that might be the first initial idea for maybe follow-up discussion, we can more critically reflect on how do we define security studies, security-related topics, and whether they are representative and inclusive enough and defined in the way that different communities and people with various identities can really fit in, very simply, whether they can apply, whether their research is fitting in these categories, or they might be very simply disencouraged or somehow put off from applying. So we will proceed now to the more like normative and practical part of the discussion. So I would like to encourage our panelists to share some ideas. How can we do better in general terms on the level of different research communities? And then in particular, what the European Initiative for Security Studies can do better in relation to conference, but generally speaking, as a community that is working and operating obviously beyond the conference. How can we do better to encourage different groups to be part? How can we also build a better, I would say, organizational culture beyond some formal steps that can be taken and not just declaratory? So can we go deeper with the inclusion, I would simply say. So Damien, if you would like to start, please.
Yes, I don't have any kind of a new idea here, but we can look at what other organizations are already doing and that we're not yet doing at EISS, or at least not as far as I know. So there's different aspects here. We can look at ISA, of course, and the type of funding that they have for trying to support scholars that come from, I think they would call it Global South. So that's one way to do it. I think sometimes there are issues with that also, that you're just looking at the affiliation, the institutional affiliation of the colleagues, and then you're assuming, okay, because they are affiliated in that institution, in that country, then that means, okay, we're meeting diversity. So, but still, I think these are good. There are, I think, you know, speaking also as someone who was putting together programs for various conferences on a yearly basis for the ISA section, you're always depending on offer, you know, and some years you have a lot of offer that allows you to have nice levels of diversity in all your panels and on the themes and methodological frameworks that you use, and some years you have nothing, you know, and then you're feeling bad because there's not enough diversity. But what can you do? That shouldn't mean you don't organize the events. So there are real kind of structural questions there of encouraging people to submit papers, and then the question becomes then how do you encourage a broader array of people to submit papers? And sometimes as an event organizer, you have to even go to the individual people and say, why don't you submit that? Nearly kind of forcing their hands as opposed to doing a big call. So basically, I guess the lesson learned here is it's not enough to just do a big call. You have to push it further and actively try to diversify to get more people to submit papers so that you have more options when you put together the panels. And that's not easy, and that's a lot of work, I think. Just a few other points. There are some broader charters that exist in the UK. A lot of institutions follow Athena's one, which is a charter for gender equality. So it doesn't apply to everything and to the intersectional aspects we're discussing, but it's just one example. And I'm sure that there are other charters out there. And this is a charter that is created for institutions to, with specific criteria to kind of rank themselves. Yeah, so you can get a bronze standard, a silver, and a gold standard. But so there might be other standards like that EISS can use to measure. Okay, how many measures are we taking? You know, can we do more when we look at these existing charters, standards that are out there? So I think, you know, that's one thing to look at. Some organizations have mentoring programs, or again, to support people, more diverse people to submit papers and to build their confidence. I think a lot of education and research is about building confidence to the research, to feel that you should submit your paper and that it's okay to present in front of all of us and so on. And then there's like the micro politics of it, such as letting not white males that are guys to start and talking first, because otherwise I will talk for another 20 minutes, but always kind of give the voice and the microphone first to, you know, someone that is a bit different than me. So there's like a lot of small steps like that, I think. When you look at big organizations, last point for EISS, you see them, ISA or journal submissions, you know, we can decide to report our data. So, you know, biographical data. I don't know the extent to which you can or even want to go there. But typically, if you remember the fee for the International Studies Association, they ask you how much money you make a year, and then your contribution to the yearly fee to be a member of the organization augments a bit when your salary goes higher. And I imagine that allows them also to track the socioeconomic profile of their membership. I'm not sure how they use it. I'm not even sure how they're allowed to use it. And I would imagine there's a GDPR kind of a minefield there. So yeah, just collecting more data on who comes. Of course, you know, we scholars, we should look at evidence and using that as a basis to think about what we're doing is one way to do it. And I'll stop here. I've got some other points, but
thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Federica, would you like to continue, please?
Thank you so much. So for some points are also connected to what has been already said. Thank you so much. So for the first part of the question, I think one of the first things would be, data collection. I think it would be great to have it, because I was trying to, whenever I'm trying to have some figures, for example, very simple figures, how many women colleagues are in academia, especially in social science and in the humanities, it's quite impossible. I mean, I wasn't able to find any collective data on that. There is a lot of data when it comes to STEMs disciplines, when you want to know how many women are in cybersecurity or in the technology in studies, or how many female scientists are out there. It's much easier to have data, but not for humanities. Maybe there is also this bias that humanities, normally there are more women than in other fields, so we don't need that data. But I think we need that data, because otherwise, I mean, it's a first step also to start to understand where we need to have some policies also, because, but starting at the university level, because it's, I studied obviously in Italy, but then I was also working in Budapest for a while, and also in Switzerland. And one common feature that was seen is that there are a lot of female students, especially in law, when there are a lot of female students at the undergraduate or graduate level. Also PhD female students, there are a lot, but then when you start building up, seeing how many professors, how many researchers, how many rectors of universities, how many head of centers, then the figures obviously slow down dramatically, I would say. So it's quite clear that there is some problems in that. And so having data on that would be great to understand where starts to be this gap, when exactly this figure starts to decline, start to understand what we can do to, I don't know, to motivate better, I don't know, women or other. Also, I'm talking about women because I'm working mostly with the women, but of course this can apply with any kind of vulnerable groups or diversity, disabled persons, whoever. And also, when it comes to what can be done, first step is like this, like what we are doing, raising awareness, and it's crucial because I guess also sometimes it's not. Maybe gender perspectives are not taken into account in some fields, and not because of any particular issue, but just because maybe sometimes people are not aware or do not start to think what they can bring in the discussion from a gender perspective. So this is also something good, also in terms of also at the institutional level. Because as also you were pointing out, I think, Šárka, saying that sometimes it's not about pinking up a little bit the institution, try to have some women there in some positions, so that then to say we are fine with gender equality. It's about having the proper training. It's about to have some training, which is the training, of course, is linked to the resource issue, of course, to have funding also for this kind of activities. And linked to the funding issues is also linked to what has been already said, the funding also to go to conferences. And of course, this is a sensitive topic in the sense that, of course, funding depends on whatever multiple reasons. So sometimes there are no fundings because there are no fundings. So you cannot do that much about it. And also linked it to the fact for example, diversity in panels and conferences. I mean, my dream would be that this would not even come a question or even come a problem, because I think I see this as really the last wheel of the problem. Because if we don't have it, it's correct that sometimes we don't have diversity because we don't have the offer from diversity, but the offer from diversity comes before that, that the fact that there is not a diversity in the universities, in program studies, or diversity in the way how then the academic path is proceeding. I'm very sorry, because it's my first ICC conference, so I have to be very honest, I'm not that much familiar what of your association, especially if you already have some working groups dealing with diversity or not within the association. But for example, I'm very familiar with the European Society of International Law. And there has been some discussion also there, so I can share a little bit, and this is my last point of what has been trying to be doing in that in our association, because also this kind of discussion is also taking place there. So, for when it comes to diversity, there is, I think, from 1 or 2 years, there is a committee, there is an advisory body on diversity, equality, and inclusion. which serves the board of the association in trying to giving advices on how to do better in terms of diversity when it comes to organizes the big conferences of the association. It's a small step, but it might help at least in gathering people who are specialists maybe in these topics, who can bring their best practices and expertise to the association. And there is also a special this kind of body also for early career scholars. And once a year, normally this association with the EISS, we have 2 big conferences per year, the annual conference as you have, and then a very smaller conference, the Early Career Scholar Conference, just for early career scholars, which I know that it's very demanding to have 2 conferences relatively big in 1 year. So there has also been discussion in the other association whether to have it every other year or not, but the idea was to try to have a space also for early career scholars, also for in terms of mentoring, so that they could, it's a very close sessions. It's a very, well, it's public, but there are small sessions where the early career scholars present their papers, so they get feedback from senior scholars, so they start to build a lighthouse, and it's also combined with a mentorship program that they are trying to start to do somehow. So these are just a few hints from my side.
Thank you very much, Federica. Raffaele.
Yes, thank you. I believe that in terms of what we can do, any initiative that aims at building a community is very important. I think this also, I mean, it's not just a way of increasing the visibility of excluded minorities, but it also is very helpful to create networks that are established and to actually, yes, allow more inclusivity in the organization. I believe that a lot of suggestions that I had, actually Damien told them. So, but it's good because it pushes me to be a bit more creative about it. I mean, the mentorship program was mentioned. I think I also had this, I think it's a very brilliant idea. And I mean, for my PhD, it has been very useful, I must say. But we all, I believe when it comes to these kind of programs and initiatives, I think we should think also how much of a weight and a burden this actually represents for minorities, because this is well, extra work for these professionals, right? Especially more senior scholars. They need to deal with 2 words basically. So any activity that is supportive to their efforts in you know, mentoring others is welcomed, of course. I also found very helpful the publication of forums in journals that discuss issues of inclusivity by organizations. I remember at the beginning of my PhD, it was very helpful for me to understand that's what one organization published such a forum, and it made me realize that, okay, this is actually a place that I would feel comfortable of going, and it's very helpful, I think, to highlight and to show what are the debates and how we think about the problems that are in academia more broadly. And then, I mean, the last point that I will have will be to bring the conversations that we're having here also outside in our outside the organization, in our daily activities, also as professors. Because I remember in my undergrad, especially, it was very common to see well, the gender studies part of the program and the post-colonial studies part of the program at the end of the syllabus. Like last 2 sessions, those 2 sessions, usually the students prepare for the exams, but don't really care. It happened even that a professor would just ask women about the gender studies part. So they knew that they could just prepare that part, and the men knew that they didn't need to prepare that part. And this, you know, actually replicates inequalities, actually. And so I think it's good to bring these conversations inside syllabuses a bit more in a cohesive way, rather than relegating them at the last part and the bottom part of the syllabus. And then also, a thought about how we cite and how we reference, who we reference. I mean, I saw in different conferences that, the literature is very male-driven and white male-driven, right? Which I don't think it's necessarily a problem until there's, that there are women and other people that actually wrote the same things, and the contribution is actually putting the literature more forward. And so you understand there is a bias there. So again, like, to conclude, anything that allows building a community that is more inclusive, and that allows to showcase that the EISS thinks about these problems and aims at addressing them, it's very much welcome.
Thank you very much for all your ideas. I will use the privilege of being the chair to add a little bit from my side. Some of my points will be overlapping with what you have already mentioned, but I would like to contribute to the debate by stressing data collection, that I agree is absolutely fundamental. So rather than just informally looking into the past program, I think we should do better job in tracing the contribution, the participation at conferences, and the general participation in the network, not only in terms of gender, but also I would say broader questions, including background, institutional affiliation, juniority, geographic representation, which I think we do on the formal level, that we are welcoming these contributions, but I think we need to do better in terms of monitoring how are we doing when it comes to that. And especially if we would see some patterns in terms of underrepresentation, we simply have to do better and go deeper with our efforts. When it comes to what you mentioned, I very much like the point on micropolitics, this everyday inclusion, that I think is much better than formal action plans. I don't like this. It's very formalistic. I think we are all very much dealing with that. But I think what we should aim for are these very little steps that can make our community simply friendlier, so that we have comfort to present, to speak, to have communications, and everyone feels fitting in, which has to do with the ordering of sections or how things are presented and again, organized at the conference, but also in more general terms. Where do we promote the call, towards which audience we communicate the call? Are we sufficiently targeting marginalized groups, or are we targeting more prestigious institutions? Because obviously we also want to have a nice program. So these are little things. I like the idea on the working group. I think the committee or some kind of group that would be working within the platform, within the board, is excellent, amazing, and I think it needs some effort. The good news, I think very often people who are interested in these principles, inclusion, etc., they are very much ready to keep going with that. So I don't think it would be a big challenge or issue to put it in practice. And my final call or proposal, and I think that would need to be discussed definitely on the organizational level. And that was linked to the first question, whether we shouldn't consider additional thematic panels, including human security, women, peace and security. I think these could be very practical steps, how we could really extend our understanding, because again, I will add my personal story. Simply, my background is in atrocity, crime prevention, human rights. I work on women, peace and security, and sometimes I struggle with not having a panel where I could really fit in. I know I could. Technically, I could send my paper somewhere and somehow add to the debate on military technology, military interventions. But then I come in and I somehow feel I do not fit in, because the debate is simply different. The debate is on strategic questions linked to military interventions or military cooperation. And there is not much room. I don't really feel comfortable enough to address questions linked to women, peace and security, atrocity, crime prevention, and human rights, which are, I would say, fundamentally important for security studies. So it's also about our understanding of the field, I would say. that would be it for me. Now I will open the floor. So I will be happy for any questions, comments, inputs to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I wanted to thank all our panelists and Chair for that. I think it's a very important topic, so I really appreciate you raising it. I especially appreciate the self-awareness of our panelists because it's a bit of an awkward discussion. And then Damien, I wanted to specifically note that I thought your research that you have done on, women and Black people in I think is highly relevant. And also I appreciate that from the perspective of you lending some of your privilege to these conversations that are really important. So I do really appreciate that. I wanted to raise some issues that I see with I wanted to do three things. First, I wanted to give a comment about some of the issues that I see existing. And then second, I wanted to talk about some of the recommendations I think can really help in the space. And then I did have a question as follow-up for our panelists. So first of all, from kind of a gender identity and sexual identity side, I think that we can probably break down issues into a few different ways. First of all, there's safety and field work, which I think you were touching on a bit. There are a lot of places that aren't safe for people to travel to or do field research in, and I think that's a really important topic. This is why often in some of these more insecure areas, you end up seeing people who are white, straight, and male going there because it's not safe for other people to go. Second point is, I think that often when women or other gender minorities are in a room, sometimes their voice can be overrun, mansplaining of course exists, and I think we have to be more aware as a society to make sure that doesn't happen. And then third, this can also happen to men, so I'm not excluding men from this. Sexual harassment, sexual assault, these are all really serious issues that occur in any professional environment. But I think especially in an environment where a lot of our work has to be kept secret just by the nature of our work, it can end up fostering an environment that might be particularly difficult to deal with some of that. And then from more of the ethnicity and race perspective, I think that we can talk about exclusion, and there is obviously very clear exclusionary language that could be discussed. But I think that one of the things that we often don't talk about as much is microaggressions, which is very serious and something that can be almost as harmful from an emotional or mental perspective as a direct aggression. And so I think doing training in that space and telling people, for example, that saying, like, since I'm Asian, I would therefore be very good at academia, can be as harmful as saying the opposite is a very, very important thing to get across. And then moving on to kind of what I would recommend. I think that there are two ways to look at events and research groups. First of all, I would recommend that organizations start taking almost like pledges. I consider it more of a pledge than a quota system, but when I was working on creating panels and putting together events, we used to say that we wouldn't put together a panel unless there was one woman on it and one person of color. It's a very basic pledge, but I think it's important to do those types of pledges just to make sure that there's visual diversity as well as diversity of thought. And then kind of going off of that as an event as a whole, I think the other thing that I would do when I was working on these types of event planning is I would often make sure that we had diversity from all regions of the world. So for example, included Black people at events, had members of the LGBTQ+ community, which obviously sometimes harder to do, but where we can kind of figure out if there are people in the space who would be interested in attending. And also make sure it's worldwide, make sure people are represented from different regions of the world. And then finally, going off of that, I would also say that I think that we need to encourage more DEI or PEI by signaling this openness with targeted messaging, funding. I know our panelists mentioned that, and just making sure that we are a space that encourages these types of conversations. So that's kind of a quick summary of some of the points that I wanted to get across. I think that the panel did an excellent job. I just think that maybe having more diversity up there would have been beneficial. So I'm sorry for taking a good amount of time to speak and just be these are some thoughts that I think need to be discussed. And I did have a quick question for you, Damien, because I do think your research that you've done on women and Black people in intelligence probably led to some very interesting conclusions. So I was hoping you could speak more about what the conclusions were of your controversial paper. So thank you, and I'm sorry for taking so long.
Thank you very much. I think we can collect a few more comments or questions to encourage more discussion and thank you.
That was hard to follow up. Thank you so much for covering topic. So we still couldn't get everything level. Also super great. There's been one thing that struck out to me when I just finished a master's in Berlin and then was looking for jobs or applying to PhD programs. Many of these jobs look like think tanks, where also some of us would land up in. They would often in their job qualifications state that they look for diversity, and they encourage that. But then at the very bottom, there be this asterisk, and then they say only people from so and so nationalities can apply. And and this is not like in a single individual thing, like it's kind of even for like jobs where you do like base level internships, like it's yes, there are security concerns with like I guess hiring an Indian in NATO, but I think it is something interesting to like think about and maybe we should reflect on what we pay lip service to as opposed to like the actual the formal norms that prohibit you from doing this. And similarly with like conferences, I've heard of many situations where people get accepted, but people don't receive visa approval, and especially and then they just cannot end up going. And I don't know what the solution is to these things, but
Thank you very much for sharing these experiences. It's really great. Anyone else? Thank you very much.
I would like to share a story that I am personally struggling with. I recently attended a conference, and there was a conference panel which, to my mind, scored top marks for diversity and inclusion. It included a professor from Exmouth University in the Global South, representing Africa, a female scholar from the Middle East, and a scholar from Europe. And we're talking about multilateralism and the challenges of multilateralism. So it was a topic that could engage anyone around the world. What happened during that panel gave me the chills. It was very scary because the conversation turned into the merits of democracy and democratic decision making. And the scholars from the Global South used arguments that were very unpalatable to me, in the sense that we actually offered a platform for challenging democracy and providing arguments for authoritarianism. So that scared me. So diversity also has a price tag. And that, I think, is a major dilemma that we are, in a broader sense, struggling with. Because the diversity and inclusion agenda is also being abused. This is not an argument not to engage in it, but it has a price. We should be aware of these repercussions, second order, third order effects. The moment we are starting to make choices as to what to do and how to make our community more inclusive. I don't have the answer, but I think it's an important aspect that we should be aware of.
Thank you, Isabel, for preparing. I guess that I've been part of it for some time. There seems to be an explosion of anti-Semitism in Europe and in Amsterdam, and especially the University of Amsterdam. And I'm from the far left, and there's now been a sort of mob thing where institutions are, I mean, that institution would be pressured by the mob thing to have ties with Israeli institutions. Demonstrations at entrance points of universities, violence, destruction. I know from the Jewish community that they feel afraid to go to university. So it's very encouraged by the leadership that the speaker from the Hebrew University was invited to speak. So praise the leadership for that. And yeah, so the general question has to do with extremism from not only extremists but also
There was one more comment from. Thank you.
Maybe to share one experience, I used to work in a think tank in London. One kind of diversities I think we didn't mention enough was social diversity in terms of money. When we consider that normal to be underpaid for 10 years before to be able to do anything, most of my colleagues ended up, and me included, ended up being part of the 5 richest percent of the society. Again, me included. Because when you end up not being able to pay your rent at the end of the month, you can still have your debt. There's bank debt. And one thing struck me was one of the key elements to make network was to participate to some black tie event. Who can afford a black tie if you can't pay your rent? And it was really quite a simple way you could see the people participating to this event and those who were just saying, nah, let's stop. And one friend of mine working in a bank found a solution for that. She passed a deal with a tailor, a renter, next to a bank, and she just made sure that it was possible for her company to pay for the renting of those suits and other things. It's simple, it didn't cost a lot to that bank, and actually the price was actually quite funny, or lower than it was, but it just solved the issue. Of this specific, it's not perfect, but it's this issue of can you participate to black tie events? If as a boss I was taking care of it, I was actually contributing to the diversity of the network I was trying to build.
Thank you very much.
Two small suggestions, but I don't know if they're very obvious, so they might have already been raised.
Go ahead.
The first one is to like building off differential rates for participation in conference. You could use the additional money that, for example, faculty pay to create a grant program and to have some MA students or only PhD students that don't have funding to be funded through that. And the other thing is opening it up to having hybrid panels rather than only in-person things. Might also make it more accessible.
Thank you very much for sharing all your experiences and also suggestions, Nico.
Just a comment. So the work on the program, it's also the program, we try to do it we can. Diversity. We do have a pledge actually, we send to all the chairs that do incredible work, selection of power. Diversity and experience of seniority, junior, etc. Also gender diversity. We try to stick as best as we can. The initial selection, the addition, the registration process, etc. Obviously, we don't come to the still far from the environment. As inclusive as we would be able to find. There's also another issue which I mentioned that really appreciate some of the suggestions that maybe we don't get enough solutions, pretty lopsided nature of the solutions. And that could be maybe changing some of the post-title themes. And we understand, I had a discussion in class where some of the themes could be already creating some kind of limiting certain kind of solutions. So we'll take that all into account. Maybe we think about those all those talents, very nature of those talents, and welcome all images.
Thank you very much. So I think last words from the panelists. I will give you like max a minute, but if you would like to have this like concluding final round in relation to what has been said, or you can just say. Okay.
Yeah, so many aspects here. I believe in pluralism just by default, and so actually I would not be, I would be personally upset if somebody here was supporting authoritarianism, of course, but I would also appreciate it in a certain paradoxical way. because it would mean that we are still in dialogue with these people. And I think that's important. And I put that on the far left, on the far right, anywhere in the spectrum. As long as we are discussing, we provide a platform for discussion with people from varying different views, some which we might consider as extremist. Of course, there are some limits there. Yeah, I don't know what they say specifically. So there are, some limits, and perhaps even a charter that can then exclude people that say absolutely horrific things. That's one thing. Another aspect, and I think also there is our European kind of identity of the association. So we're based in Europe, so actually it limits it, but also in some ways we're better geographically located to tie to others, other continents than if we were in North America, where the big conferences are. And there's something perhaps to explore there. And then one last point we didn't touch upon is one aspect of EISS's engagement with policymakers. Does EISS have a responsibility to also bring these themes to policymakers during engagement with NATO and so on? Do we need to pay attention to that aspect? EU SWAMOS also, we talked a lot about networking, and that was a solution that was identified by a few colleagues. Should there be an element of EU SWAMOS that also looks at these questions as a part of the networking too? Just a couple of other ideas.
Thank you very much. Federica, your final words.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, some of the questions I couldn't get it very well, but thank you so much for sharing your experiences. But I think if you have many specific questions, you can always come back to me, because I couldn't hear almost most of the discussion, but it was great. And maybe one thing that whenever also I participate in this kind of roundtables, I say that there's a lot of engagement and discussion from the audience, which I think makes me think that these things are more needed, as it was already said. Also, maybe during the conference, because maybe 1 hour is not enough to talk about these issues. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I would just address 2 points raised here, but thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. I think especially the social diversity aspect, I think is very important. The points that I would like to address involve the inclusivity in the job market. I will refer to academia now, but I understand that it's a struggle for also other fields, other jobs. But I think we should also pay a lot of attention of what is happening right now in academia, or better across Europe, because a lot of rights also on that side are being undermined, in the sense that at least in the Italian context, it's becoming more and more difficult to accept PhD students from countries that are not European. There are really constraints that are put in place, and they are growing. So I think it's also for the next conference, maybe we can also have a discussion on how to support scholars in this sense. I think it's very important. And then on the pluralism, I don't know what was the discussion in the conference, but I believe that, we as academics, we are here to discuss, right? And to build arguments. And I think that knowing, I think it's good to know debates that go against our ideals, because then we can build better arguments. I think that's our job. And in this sense, the exclusion and the homogeneity of debates is never beneficial, because for a long time we thought that democratic regimes are always good. I'm sorry, again, I'm Italian, but like the women rights and LGBT rights are not that nice now. And I think also for a long time we thought that democracy is built to the international order, then just to find out by including voices from the global south that also post-colonial countries have very much pushed for human rights, because for them it was also a way to establish their sovereignty. So I think it's always good to have these debates together with the excluded approaches to understand how to make better arguments, basically. But thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
So thank you very much for your kind contributions to the discussion. Firstly, to the amazing panelists that shared their ideas. Also to all of you who contributed with your personal experiences, ideas, insight, but also to those who just came to listen, because I think that's very important for us to progress and to do better, to keep our conversation as broad in terms of participants. And even if you just are here and you pay attention to some of these remarks and experiences, it matters. It's very important. It's the micropolitics of inclusion, I would say. We will keep going with the discussion. I think it's already like somehow established that we will keep, I hope, Hugo, I'm right, that we will keep going with this roundtable in the upcoming conferences. So I'm looking forward that you will join us next year. And we will focus on some of these topics. So thank you again. And it's not over yet. We have the award afterwards, so I can announce that you should stay here. There is no break in between. I'm sorry for that, but we have a packed program. So there will be the award, then final conclusions from the chair, from Hugo, and then cocktail. Thank you very much.